So far as we know, the oldest version of the Palm Sunday story and the Passion narrative is found in the Gospel of Mark. Matthew, Luke, and John copy his basic narrative, and they edit it. They add their color. They have their commentary. The narrative itself is brilliant. It's poetic. It's full of symbolism and metaphor. In fact, it's so brilliant, I have to admit that I'm kind of dubious about whether Mark is the original author. Mark writes in very bad grammar and repetition. Mark's not a great writer, and the Passion narrative itself is one of the finest pieces ever written. So I have reason to think maybe he wasn't the first guy to come up with the story. And there are some hints buried in Mark's account. For example, Mark doesn't mention palm fronds on this text that we call the Palm Sunday text. Mark says, "Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches they had cut in the fields." Now, Mark places the Easter around Passover, which is either March or April. And even in Israel, there are no leafy branches in the fields in the spring. So Matthew, Luke, and John change the leafy branches to palms, which are evergreens, which are available in the spring. Still, it's a hint that Mark is borrowing from an older version of the narrative that would have placed it, and Bishop Spong insists that it would have been around the time of the Festival of Booths, when they did cut branches and make temporary shelters in the fields. It was a harvest festival in Israel in the fall, so it would have been easy to run out and grab cut branches and throw them on the path. So Bishop Spong is at least convinced that that's what it was. I'm convinced that Mark kind of sloppily edited a better story than Mark could write. That's my take on it. Mark moved the story from having happened early in the fall to early spring because there is some symbolic value to Jesus being killed at the time that the Passover lamb is sacrificed. It has what we call homiletic value. Preachers study homiletics, which is preaching, and so we have been known to take liberties with texts in order to make them more powerful. In fact, I have often said, were it not for exaggeration, I wouldn't have a job at all. There are times that the art of storytelling requires a certain illumination to the text. The Gospels are not trying to give us a technically true account of the death of Jesus. They're trying to record a theologically persuasive take on the events. Not this happened on Thursday, this happened on Friday, this happened on Saturday, but to tell the story in a way that helps to open your heart and mind to personal change and faith. In that sense, they're not being dishonest if you look at it as literature. The same is done anytime you try to write a biography or do a biographical movie. You can't do a movie about the life of Martin Luther King, for example, that is fair to the events in Martin Luther King's life that's not 20 or 30 hours long. So if you're going to get it down to 90 minutes, you're going to take some literary liberties. And I'm willing to say that that's what the gospel writers did. But if you try to read the Gospels as if they are giving you literal fact, I got to warn you that it reads a little bit more like Sean Spicer's press conference than it does a history book. There's generous editing going on here. Now, that would upset a lot of modern evangelicals because they want the Bible to be true. They want it to be true when it talks about Balaam's donkey talking to him, about Jonah spending 3 days in the belly of a whale, and Jesus walking on water. It's all true, true, true. They emotionally need for it all to be not just poetically or metaphorically true or part of a literary persuasion. They need it to be factually true in historical specifics. And that insistence means that if you actually study Scripture, your faith is going to come crashing down all around your ears. I saw people in graduate school stand up and leave the room and never come back to seminary when they realized that the text was not telling the truth about history. It's trying to tell a bigger truth. Now, when Matthew takes up Mark's narrative, he wants to add a whole lot of quotes from the Hebrew Bible, just like a bad PhD student that feels like every footnote makes their dissertation better. In Matthew's mind, every time he can associate Jesus with some image out of the Old Testament, it makes his whole narrative more believable, presuming that you're the kind of person that believes that quotes from the Hebrew Bible help your argument. So where Mark has Jesus send the disciples to get a colt for him to ride on, Matthew wants to add an image from the 9th chapter of Zechariah. Zechariah says, "Behold, your king is coming to you, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now Matthew should have known, in fact, he should know better than anyone here, that Hebrew poetry uses a technique called parallelism. They didn't write rhyming poetry the way we do in English. They would write a sentence, "He came riding on a donkey," and then they would write a second sentence that reflected almost what the previous sentences said. "On a colt, the foal of a donkey." It's just poetry. It's just the style of writing. So Zechariah isn't saying that he rode on a donkey and a colt. He's just saying small animal that you ride on. Matthew, however, wants to quote him literally. He has Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey and a colt. Now try to picture that. Were his legs so long that he could straddle both animals? Or was he riding in Dixie Stampede style, with a foot on the back of each animal like a stunt rider? If you take Matthew at his word, the triumphal entry starts to look a little bit like a circus, doesn't it? It has taken me a while to get to my point. You should be used to that by now. I won't even apologize. But whoever Matthew was, we don't know whether this was written by Matthew. We don't know for sure, but it's called Matthew. But whoever he was, I'm sure he was a good guy. In fact, that older printings of the Bible say he's a saint. I mean, who am I to argue with that? So he's probably a pretty good guy. But he is playing fast and loose with the facts in order to make reality bend to his agenda. He doesn't start writing just to record what he saw happen. He's got an agenda. And he is making historical events look like they support his agenda. And he believes that Jesus is so important that Old Testament prophets hundreds of years ago, consciously or unconsciously, were writing about Jesus. Whether they meant to or not, he believes that images of Jesus are buried in Old Testament scriptures. Ancient writers would often glide very easily between fairly factual accounts of events right into more magical and superstitious sorts of flourishes. It's the way a lot of ancient literature is written. A lot of that unmoored way of writing was pretty self-serving. Now, if you read the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, and I don't know why you would, but if you do, you can take Josephus quite seriously when he is talking about national historical events. It's been remarkable to discover, based on archaeology, how accurate that Josephus was when he described things that happened. But when Josephus is talking about himself, it is safe to assume that he is an exaggerating, narcissistic liar. He puts himself into every colorful event that could have possibly happened to a superhero. So when you're looking at Josephus or Matthew across the gulf of a couple of thousand years, it's not hard to see where they were editorially taking ridiculous liberties. But it's not just an ancient problem, is it? When Vice President Pence says that global warming is a hoax, but the Genesis account of Noah's Ark is historical, then you realize that he's not being just dishonest, he is choosing a way of viewing the truth that serves his agenda. He's got an agenda that he wants to see enacted nationally or globally. So he's chosen to take a very conservative evangelical view of history and of the world so that he can believe that ancient myths are true and that modern science is not true. And that then allows him to do absolutely horrible and destructive things to the planet, to women, to the poor, to minorities. But it all fits in with his view of reality. So he can do these horrible things and simultaneously see himself as being godly. I know that every one of you has a family member or friend who's just like this. And you don't have to say their name. But I know that we know. Now, sitting here 1,000 miles away from Washington, D.C., and light years away from evangelical ideology, we can wonder if Pence really believes in Noah's Ark, if he really believes that global warming is a hoax. You might think that people like Mike Pence are stupid like a fox, and that could be true. But what I find somewhat more disturbing is that he just might, really, absolutely believe that stuff. And to the extent that Mike Pence and millions upon millions of other people in the world are capable of confidently believing things that are clearly, absolutely false, then we need to come to terms with the real challenge that we face in trying to pull our civilization into a more fact-based way of thinking about religion and about politics and economics and certainly about science. This week it was revealed that Susan Rice, President Obama's national security advisor, had asked to have the names of American citizens who had been caught up in their monitoring of foreign agents revealed, at least as it related to the 2016 election. Now, that would be a violation of privacy laws if it were done for purely political purposes. If Susan Rice was just trying to undermine the Trump campaign or the Trump presidency. However, the people she was wanting to document were not just private citizens working on the Trump transition team. They were Trump transition team people who were secretly meeting with Russian advisors on the Seychelles Islands off the coast of Africa to establish a back door between Trump and Putin. And if that seems impossibly complicated, let's just say that Rice was investigating treason. And by the way, the guy that Trump sent to the Seychelles Islands to meet with Putin's representative was the founder of Blackwater, the Army for Hire, Eric Prince. And Eric Prince, if you did not know it, is the brother of Betsy DeVos, the ridiculously unqualified Secretary of Education. Amen. If any of this had appeared in a movie, we would have thought this is a poorly written movie because this is too crazy to be believed. You can't make this stuff up. These entanglements are frighteningly serious. When you add up all the connections between Trump and Putin in both the tampering with the 2016 election and the whole issue of Russian sanctions, as well as multi-billion-dollar oil deals. Putin may be the richest person in the world because of his ownership of oil rights in Russia. Hence, we appoint a Secretary of State who is a career oil man to finish a multi-billion-dollar oil deal that will make an awful lot of people you've never heard of extraordinarily rich. But trust me, it's not for you. It's not to do anything for you. It seems to me that it is inescapable that sometime within the next year, someone will be asking Donald Trump and a number of his associates if they would like to have a blindfold and a cigarette before the firing squad loads their guns. Still, there is a very peculiar event in that Trump supporters have not changed their view of him in spite of all of these revelations that should absolutely scare you to death. And what is worse, the Trump surrogates have been appearing on news shows telling us that the real crime is not the treasonous connections between Trump and Russian spies, but they would have you to believe that Susan Rice is the criminal because she was investigating the treason. This is bending reality to serve your agenda, turning self-serving prejudice into alternative facts, like, bear with me, like insisting that Christianity is superior to all other religions, like Muslims insisting that everyone is born a Muslim and only some fall away. These are not facts, but billions upon billions of people treat these prejudices as if they were true. Can it be any wonder then that a huge portion of our voting public is willing to believe in alternative facts? Because we have raised ourselves in religious communities in which choosing an alternative fact is not only encouraged, it is rewarded. A couple of months ago, Trump's Treasury Secretary absolutely promised that there would be no tax cuts for the upper class. One of the things we feared about electing a billionaire president who appointed investment bankers to his cabinet is that this would end up being huge tax cuts for the rich and a loss for everyone else. So the Treasury Secretary promised that absolutely will not happen. But then when the repeal and replace bill came out to replace Obamacare, the bill provided for tax cuts of $158 billion to the wealthiest Wall Street investors, $145 billion to insurance corporations, $25 billion to pharmaceutical companies, and $20 billion to medical device corporations. I know quoting numbers in a public speech is not the best way to communicate, so let me just boil this down for you. Had the replacement bill passed, it would have been the largest single transfer of wealth from the poor and middle class to the top 1% in the history of the world. It would have been the largest single transfer of wealth ever. After having promised that the middle class is forgotten no more, that health care was going to become better and cheaper, and that everyone would have it. Lying to the masses while transferring wealth to the super rich would make most honest people simply collapse under the weight of the guilt. But when you can successfully blind yourself to reality under a kind of ideology, then it doesn't even feel like lying anymore. Alternative facts become legitimate. Evangelicals can resolutely hold on to a worldview in which Jonah can live in a whale, snakes and donkeys can talk, angels and demons are real, and the super rich can assume that they are entitled, so that any degree of lying that they do to the dumb masses of unfortunates is justifiable because they believe that they are entitled to your money. It sounds horrible to say it that way, but I implore you to look at it. Now, you might think that Trump is a rube, and I don't think he's very smart, but Paul Ryan is smart. He is educated, he is an experienced politician, and he wrote that health care bill. And before it did anything else, before it paid for anybody's prescription medicine or hospital visit, it would have given $350 billion with a B dollars to the super wealthy while kicking 20 million people off of health insurance, and I'm one of those 20 million. And Paul Ryan thinks of himself as an ardent Christian, while advocating for a legislative move that would have directly caused the premature death, eventually, of millions of poor people, in order to give a huge amount of money to about 2,000 people, all of whom have more money than they know what to do with right now. I mean, what, you going to have your Mercedes built out of mink next time? They have so much money, so many houses, so many cars that they have no idea what to do with more money. And yet, the motivation of Paul Ryan is to make sure that they get more, because they really think it's theirs. They really do have a sense of entitlement. Under the guise of pursuing justice and accomplishing a conservative Christian set of goals, Ryan, Trump, Pence, and their ilk are attempting to do things that are indisputably evil. And if I'm wrong, please tell me how I'm wrong. And yet next week, hundreds of millions of people in the United States will go to American churches where their priests and pastors will tell them not to worry about what happens in this life, because as soon as your health insurance is canceled and you die, you will get to go to eternal reward. So while my liberal friends are often quite devoted to being mad at Ryan, Trump, and Pence, I have to say that I have less than warm feelings about my peers in the ministry who keep setting up their church folks to be herded to the slaughter like sheep. Now, I don't want to appear to be against evangelical religion for the sake of promoting a more progressive view, but folks, it is hard and unavoidable to me that if you constantly feed a line of absurd beliefs, calling it faith, insisting that believing in what is clearly not true is a virtue, and that somehow being a good spiritual person means slowly assassinating your brains, that only sets up the population to follow the likes of Assad, of Putin, and of Trump. And in that sense, religion is almost always the sock puppet of dictators. I think that should stop. Am I alone in that? No. As you've heard me quote Voltaire many times, those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. As long as religious leaders keep telling people to put their reason on the shelf so that they can believe that Noah's Ark is real and not recognize the fact that sea levels are rising and we're going to need a boat or something to survive, then religion will continue to be the partner of tyrants. A healthy spirituality can foster wonderful things: forgiveness, generosity, mercy, compassion. Unhealthy spirituality bolsters bad government, a lethally unfair distribution of wealth, and an indifference towards the destruction of our planet. Now, our church exists, stated in our mission statement, to promote healthy spirituality. And we have a large online audience, but I got to tell you the truth. I wish that this was the largest congregation in the city. I wish that I could believe that progressive communities of faith were drawing more and more thinking, critically thinking people to help be a leading force in the future. But it's not happening, and I think it needs to happen. There needs to be massive progressive reformation in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, in Buddhism, and in Hinduism. And until there is a massive reformation within those major world religions, then I don't think we have any reason to expect Republicans and Democrats to ever change. I think both parties will continue to use disinformation to stay in power. I know that a lot of our generation's progressives have given up on religion. They don't want to have anything to do with church. And I find it hard to argue with them, because I think that organized religion has such a trail of carnage that lies in its wake that I can't blame anyone that doesn't want to give it another chance. I really can't. But as bad as organized religion has been, please consider the fact that the government of the United States is currently acting like an oil company that has a standing army and a nuclear arsenal. Schools are less concerned with teaching critical thinking and more intent upon teaching technical skills. Even liberal arts universities are shifting from teaching people how to think and teaching them how to do jobs, so that they can serve the profit motive of corporations better and not challenge their corporate masters. Churches that deny reason, churches that ignore science, churches that teach obedience to the exclusion of teaching prophetic challenge to power have been a boil on the butt of the world for centuries. But without faith communities that continue to teach, encourage, organize, and inspire justice, compassion, and social action, then I fear we are facing a future without leaders. When our grandchildren ask us, "What did you do during the Trump crisis?" I hope we'll be able to look them right in the face and tell them that we went along kicking and screaming every single day.
Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.